oil painting, still life oil painting, and I'm going to show you my process from start to finish. I've got really wonderful still life setup today with some melons and various fruits and flowers. A beautiful vase that belongs to a friend. So excited. All right. I'm going to go over my materials list to begin. So I have titanium white, cadmium yellow pale, cadmium yellow deep, yellow ochre pale, cadmium orange, cadmium red, terra rosa, permanent rose, transparent oxide red, transparent oxide brown, viridian cobalt blue light, ultramarine blue deep, and I have a new color that I'm pretty excited about. Sennelier makes it, and it's King's Blue, and it's a really great color. A lot of my friends are using it. My friends like Michelle Dunaway actually introduced me to this color, and I really am enjoying it, so hopefully we'll get a chance to show you what it can do today. I'm also using brushes. Some of my favorite brushes are made by Rosemary and Company. She's out of England, and she makes an excellent product. The only medium that I'm using today will be a little bit of walnut oil, and I'll explain why I use that as we go along. I'm mostly going to use it in the initial part or the beginning of the painting, but I'll use it throughout as well, and as I use it, hopefully I'll remember to tell you that I am, and therefore why I'm using it. And then I've got some mineral spirits down here, or just terpenoid or Gamsol, whatever it is, solvent to clean my brushes. Alright? The only other tool I'd like to talk about, one of the most important, apart from the paint itself, is my substrate. It's linen canvas that is lead primed, and there's a lot of really great canvases out there. I'm not particularly sure which one of these I'm using today, but I have various ones that I use. Just look for a really quality linen canvas that's primed well and archival. I want my paintings to outlive me. So I do want to talk a little bit about how I have set up, and then we'll get right into painting. Because so many problems arise with artists during the painting process. It seems that in the middle of their painting, or after they've established a great deal with their composition, they've applied great amounts of paint, they run into problems, right? Have you ever done that? Have you ever painted, or how many of you are artists? I think most, not all of you are. What do? You have just a few choices. First of all, you either wipe it off and start again, which a lot of people don't want to do because they either believe they can't paint it again, or that it's so nicely painted they're just afraid to wipe it off, or it's just going to take too much time to do it again. So that's one option. Or they live with that mistake, and I consider that a fate worse than death. Okay? A fate worse than death would be for me 50 years from now to have that painting haunt me, have that mistake haunt me. It's like marrying the wrong person to me, right? I have to marry this, and that's how I look at it. Every color choice, every brush technique, all of these choices, I am marrying this painting. I have already painted this. See? In here. I've already seen what this painting looks like, because I took the time to carefully set it up and paint it in my mind. Before the brush ever touches the canvas, I've already worked out all of my problems. I've done all of my problem solving here. Okay? So because of that, now I can just have a good time. As I set this up, as I decided on my composition, I asked these questions. Where's my darkest dark? Where's my lightest light? Where are my hard edges? Where are my soft edges? Where are the edges lost in or scrape with a palette knife? Where will I lay the paint on super thick as I can go? Where will it be as thin as possible? I go through that whole thing as I study my composition, and I make those decisions ahead of time. I'm going to take my walnut oil. Because of this canvas, it's a little more absorbent than I care for it to be. So I'm compensating by adding the medium. And I'm doing it in the initial wash. I'm doing it now. This is just how I prefer to do it. This isn't always what I do, but today I'm going to be doing it. And it makes it so that I won't need very much medium throughout the rest of the process. Okay? So I'm just washing that on very quickly, and then I'm going to tone the canvas with a little bit of color with a large brush. Wash that on. And then with my paper towel, we'll wipe off some excess. Alright, so we've got our basic wash. Now look, just as an example, how well you'll be able to see the light. Anywhere that I'm going to put a light value, it shows up right away. That would never show up on just the white canvas. You would never be able to see it, so then how would you know if it's the correct value or not? How would you be able to assess your lights in your painting unless you set yourself up like this? So the next step for me is to get my proportions in right away, my drawing, okay? Now, a lot of people think of drawing as lines, only linear, thin lines, but drawing is throughout the entire painting process, all right? With each brush stroke, I am affecting the drawing. So as I'm painting throughout the entire morning and afternoon here, throughout this entire video production, I'm drawing, or I'm affecting the drawing of this painting. But just to get me started, and just to get off on the right track, I'm going to use some Terra Rosa here and put in some narrow lines to indicate proportion, to get the placement of everything how I want it, and to make sure that my drawing is correct. And these lines aren't necessarily going to be perfect. I'm not going to do perfectly rounded things. We've got watermelon and cantaloupe and peaches and honeydew melons, all these things. But they're not perfectly spherical. There's a lot of flatter sides to many of these objects. I'm merely going to indicate where things go and what their proportions are. So I'm just measuring as I go to the top of the vase, into the cantaloupe. So you can see how I'm just very simply putting in, indicating where things go, what their height is, what their width is compared to their height, and moving throughout the painting as I do it, until I've got roughly the entire thing sketched out. I usually have more foreground than a common table will permit. I mean, in my canvas, I've got more foreground. So what I do is I leave these areas open. I can come back to them and add various things. But I plan that ahead. I mean, I don't just, I know I'm going to do that. All right. So the next thing is to establish, I sort of have an order to things. I'm always open to changing it depending on the painting. But there are some essentials that I have found to be most helpful when working in this method. After I've established my proportions, I'll then take the time to check my drawing, check my proportions, make sure it's accurate. You especially want to do this if you're working with something like a portrait. You can't just indicate where things go and hope that you're right. You better take the time to step back. Don't just jump right into it. Step back. Make sure you've got as much accuracy as possible. But then, once I'm comfortable with this, I'll then move on to answering those questions that I started asking a while back. Now, where's my darkest dark? in my setup. Where is my lightest light? Those are my parameters. Those are my extremes. And they're usually the easiest things to spot. They're usually the easiest things to identify in your subject, especially the darkest dark I've noticed, because you can't go any darker than that. And because our lights today, we'll talk a little bit about that later, but our lights are cool temperature, our shadows are warm, we know our darkest darks are going to be our warmest warms. So I can probably spot those and be accurate right away. So I go for those easy things first. Something like transparent oxide brown, and maybe a little bit of ultramarine blue tea. Not too blue because, as I just said, I want it to be warmer in temperature. But that makes, I don't have any black on my palette because I like to just make my own and control the temperature. But this represents my black, my absence of black. So I just put it in, just a note of it sometimes, okay, and I need to adjust it and add a little more blue. So there I have my darkest dark. Now what happens is anywhere else in the composition, if I see a dark, if I see a shadow, I then ask myself, is it as dark as my darkest dark? I may see a dark in there, but that doesn't mean it's as dark as my darkest dark. See? I now have something accurate on my canvas that I can compare every other dark to. I can do the same with my light. Where's my lightest light? So clearly, to me, it's that highlight on this base here. Now I can either just go to the extreme, put some white there, and I'll do that. With that little amount of paint on there, if there were something incorrect, it'd be so easy to adjust it, wouldn't it? It'd be so easy now to change it if I needed to. But if I just jump right to the next thing and start going in there right away, adding all of this other stuff without checking, without verifying whether or not what I've established is correct, I'm likely to just live with that or choose to live with it. I don't want to do that. By just putting a note on there, I can easily change it if I need to. Okay, so now I feel comfortable with moving on, and I'm going to start blocking in using color. Just not getting caught in any real detail. I tend to use a stiffer brush when doing something like this, just because I want it to be as loose as possible. It's important that if your objective is to have a painterly painting, or whatever verbiage you want to use, it's loose, it's painterly, it's abstract, however you describe it. It's important that if that's your goal, and for so many it is, if that's your goal, then you should start that way. It's so important to have a good start, your beginning, the initial stage of painting. Reflect that. Because you can start loose and refine it as you go. It's very difficult to have a very tight, refined painting and try to loosen it up later. So now, with most of this painting, my goal is to have very accurate color and values, and of course temperature. With my background, however, because of just what I brought, I'm going to probably make it however I want. I might adjust it just a little bit as I go. Okay, so just laying in the background, but as long as my values and the color temperature are what I would consider to be accurate, I can See, that's another question that I ask myself when setting up, not just the essentials, where's my lightest light, where's my darkest dark. Sometimes I ask myself, where can I get away with whatever I want? Is there an area of the painting that I could get away with murder, basically? How am I going to paint this? And I know that with backgrounds, usually, especially if it has an intricate fabric, I can add whatever colors I like and take artistic license. See, the more you paint, the more experienced you become in that, in this medium, the more accurately you'll be able to assess things, and I think the more freedom you'll have as you paint, and knowing what you could really take artistic license with and it still be believable. As long as it still looks like what you intended it to look like. Okay? If that makes any sense. It does to me, but a lot of things make sense in my head. Only. So there's a lot of beautiful color in the fabric to begin with, but I'm going to adjust it and put it where I like, because I can. There's one thing I learned very early on, especially from Mr. Richard, that's Richard Schmid, is the importance, what he calls the importance of a sound start. The word sound or soundness means wholeness or integrity. That's what that word means. And so when you have integrity from the beginning, you're likely to retain that throughout the entire process. That's why it's important to have it at the beginning. Even to me, is the most important one of. It's all important, but it's so important that I have a good start. One thing that I advocate in all my workshops, I've written articles about it. Many artists whose work I admire have said and done the same, and that is that there are no rules. And I love that. And if there were, wouldn't you want to break them anyway? Wouldn't something good, something new possibly come of breaking those rules? So there are no rules with painting. So there's not one way to hold the brush, despite what many might tell you. There's not one way to do this. There's not one way to start. If I want to take my brush, don't let Rosemary see this, but if I want to take my brush and just get it really, to me this is interesting, and roll it up the canvas, I'll do that. Who's to say you can't? Or who's to say that there's just one way to do it? There isn't. You can use the other end of the brush if you want. So come up with your own way. Develop your own way. However you like. Okay. So I spend a little more time with that because usually with my background, it's finished usually right from the beginning. Some of the others I'm just going to do what I consider to be more a block in. But with the background fabrics, I tend to complete those right away.
I'm just laying in the colors, but I'm not necessarily guessing. I am testing. You'll notice that I put a color down and I swipe it on just a little bit and I look at it and I want to make sure. And in the studio, I step back as often as I put the brush down, it seems. I'll sometimes just do that, step back and take a look and then decide whether or not it's correct. I want accurate color and accurate value, but not necessarily a specific technique. I'm just trying to efficiently, quickly put some color down. Another thing that you might notice, I'm not sure how this is going to appear on something like a DVD, but because of the lighting situation here, normally in my studio, I make sure that I only have I may have multiple sources of light, meaning that I may have several lamps going or several windows, but I want them all coming from the same direction. If I have several directions at one time, like we do today, I tend to lose a lot of the shadows, and it makes things look flat. So I'm going to probably you might notice, I might make some of my shadows just slightly darker than what's actually in front of me, because I know that were this light that's necessary for this filming not here, my shadows would be very dark, causing a great sense of depth. So just moving throughout the painting, each color, my palette's looking messy, but I'll clean it as soon as I'm run out of room, or hopefully finish the block in. So that was just a little bit of cadmium orange and yellow ochre pale. I like the yellow ochre pale more than just plain old yellow ochre because it's lighter in value, and I seem to have more of a use for it. I just like it more as a color in general. But you can see how even with this, all of the paint that's on here, it's all very thin at this point. But already we have a very clear idea of where we're headed. And so with the block in, there's no rule about it. Some people feel that you have to cover the entire canvas before it's a finished or completed block in. But that's not true. For some paintings and sometimes it's just a few things I block in and I'm already ready to go. You are the only one who really knows when you're going to switch modes, when you go from block in mode to refining the painting mode or that more finished brushwork mode. So it varies from time to time. But for the sake of this, for the sake of you seeing what I see, I'm going to put in as much of a block in as possible. You'll notice that I'm cleaning my brush. That color's wrong. But I'm cleaning my brush or just switching to a new brush each time. I'm keeping, even though I've got all of this paint on here, all of this color is still, I'm keeping it very clean. There we go. It's important that I do so. Have you ever had what some call muddy color or chalky color? This helps me avoid that by keeping my colors very clean, not contaminating them, not moving from a dark to a light, right? All right, we're almost done with the block in. Just adding a few more colors. Sometimes even I mean, obviously I want to go for as accurate color as possible, but sometimes I'll know what the next layer of something is, and I know I can go a little more vivid than I might need to, because but I'd rather start with clean, vivid color right away. Because I can always mute it or always make it a little more grayed down or dull later. It's very difficult to start with gray, dull color and make it, kind of liven it up, make it cleaner. It's almost impossible to do so. So instead, I'll start with sometimes I'll start with brighter, more vivid color, knowing that I could always gray it down later if I need to. It's very difficult to bring something up, bring the chroma up, starting with gray, than it is to start with high chroma and gray it down. So there's some great color in all of this. And just a few more notes of color until I feel that I've reached a point where, okay, I need to start putting the refined brushwork in, or the more finished sort of brushwork. For some of this white fabric with the grays, yesterday Katie Swatland was talking about all of the beautiful colors in white. It's never just white. And sometimes there's really beautiful colors, even in the shadows of white. So for this and some of those shadows, I don't have many. But for the ones that I do, I'm using transparent oxide brown, viridian, and white. I could go darker than that. Simply by having less white in that mixture, I could be darker in the value. And that may not be necessary to put that, to block that in right away, but I like to put at least a little bit of it so that I have an idea of my shadow colors. And then I can step back and assess, compare my painting to the subject and make sure that it's accurate, because it's so easy to change any of this. There's hardly any paint on here. It would be so easy. You know how you paint something beautifully and then realize it's wrong, but it's so beautifully painted? Well, I would not feel bad if I had to wipe any of this off and do it again, because there's so little paint on there, and it was so quickly done. See? So that would be the time to assess where are the mistakes, where do things need to be adjusted. Before I marry this, I need to make sure it's worth marrying, okay? It's a funny thing to think about, but you'll remember it. I know you will. Just a few more colors. A few more notes of color. And this is just one way of painting. As I said, every painting, it seems, calls for something at least slightly different from the next. And then there's always some discovery. There's always some little bit about it that makes it an adventure all on its own. So don't get caught up in well, this is how he did it, or this is how my favorite artist, whoever he or she may be, this is how they paint. Well, that may be how you saw them paint once, but I bet they have many ways of doing it. But they treat each one like a tool in their tool belt, and they've mastered all of those ways, so that when they look at composition, when they look at a subject, they can then assess for themselves what the most appropriate way of painting that would be. So I recommend that you experiment. Always, always be trying something new, trying something different, so that you can have tools in your tool belt or words in your vocabulary with which to speak, right? The more you know, the more eloquently you can express yourself. And painting is as much a language as English or Chinese or Spanish or any other language. Sometimes it's better than all of those too, I think. I was shy as a little boy. I never said a word. But I learned I could draw or paint. It was how I spoke. All right, just getting back to what I said initially, remember how I said that this is the time to be as loose as possible? You'll notice, I mean, it looks like coloring with a crayon or something, which I love. That I love. But, to be serious, it's as loose as I could possibly get. I will take a paper towel sometimes and just make it even looser, because this is the time to do that, right? You would never do that with a lot of paint on the canvas. You would never do that after you've worked really hard to perfect or finish an area of the painting. But if you want that painterly look, you want some of those edges, you want some of that looseness, this is the time to do it, because you can always refine it from here, but you can't go backwards. All right, so let's quickly assess what we've established. We've got our lightest light, our darkest dark. We've also taken the time to establish some temperature. We have cool light, therefore our shadows are warmer than whatever's in the light. You can think of it as not just light, but let's think of it as coolness. All right? Therefore, anything receiving a greater amount of coolness is going to appear cooler than something receiving less coolness, or rather growing away from that and therefore getting warmer. So we've got cooler lights and warmer shadows. And it's all relative, okay? And so many get hung up on that, but if you really study it, study the science about it, what makes it so, and you'll begin to understand it, and you'll need to put that into your painting so that it is believable. So I'm already happy with this painting, how it's progressing. And like I mentioned earlier, I tend to switch modes. That block-in mode is let's lay down the color, let's put it on efficiently, quickly, as accurately as possible. But then as soon as you're comfortable, as soon as you've got enough that you feel you're comfortable, you've got your block-in or your roadmap, now you sit back and you don't have to intentionally do it, it just something changes where you know, okay, even your heart starts to beat a little slower. Where at first you were just like a swordsman getting stuff in and laying everything down, and then all of a sudden things become very precise. It becomes all about precision, because now it's about the finish. Even though we're far from finished, we can clearly see where we're going. Do you know what I'm saying? Even the observer, the audience, you can probably clearly tell you know where I'm going now. Whereas before, maybe you didn't. With just the few lines or a few colors, maybe you couldn't see what I saw. But now you're probably a little closer to seeing what I see when I look at that subject. So now we switch modes. now it's all about the finish. How are we going to finish this? And I think one of the most important questions when it comes to finishing a painting is what I'm about to put down going to strengthen what I've already established, going to enhance it or complement it in some way, or is it going to weaken it? Is it going to distract from what I've already established, right? I always think of a movie cast. If you've got your star and your co-stars, your secondary stars, lined up, maybe you're shooting in a city, it's a city scene, you've established everything, you've dressed them properly, and then you've got a guy walking across the street with a 10-gallon hat and sequins everywhere on his clothes. What does the director do? He says, wait a minute, cut. Get that guy out of here, or change his clothes, right? Because he's going to weaken the composition that I want and that I've established with my stars for this particular shot in this movie. Does that make sense? Okay? So it's the same thing for me. With each brushstroke now, I'm thinking of the finish. And is it going to strengthen what I've already established or weaken it? Now, to enhance what I want to draw attention to, I'll refine those things more than others. I'll leave the fringe, the outer regions of a composition sometimes loose or more painterly, less paint, less texture or thick paint, less refined drawing or edge work or something like that, just because I want to draw attention to something else. But I can move anywhere in the painting that I want. I'm not going to blur all of the edges and sharpen one just to make it the center of interest. I'm going to be true to what's actually in front of me and how I see it. So I'm working on the vase here. I've done the same that I did for the shadows in this cloth, which is transparent oxide brown, viridian, and white. That seems to be a gray that I often mix because I can warm it by adding more transparent oxide brown or red or another warmer color, or I can cool it by adding a little more viridian and white. So it seems like a good color to start when painting this vase. As far as my decision as what to paint next, where do I move on from here? It's sort of, it may seem kind of random, but for me it's just preference. What do I want to finish? What do I want to bring to a state of real finish? And what do I want to leave alone? Also, I ask myself, what do I know when I look at my subject? What do I know I can get accurate right from the beginning? What can I work on? What part of this painting can I start with at this point and know that I can be accurate? Because the more accuracy I have on my canvas, the more I have to compare the more difficult things to. If you really listen to the things that I'm saying, all of them, I'm trying my best not to use any sort of subjective terms. I want things to be simplified, not because we're not capable of understanding, but because our objective is a successful painting. So all of the things that I'm telling you are things that I think of as I'm painting at home in my studio in order that I can create what I would consider to be a successful painting. So now I'm just adding more white to that as I paint this vase here. I'm not putting color everywhere. That's a little too cool. Let's add some yellow ochre to that. Someone had asked about using the medium. If you were here at the beginning, you'll notice that we put walnut oil and that's what I'm using as a medium today. That's not what I always use. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I put that all over the canvas and wiped off the excess, but a lot of it remained on there so that any color I put on here initially in the block in, I was able to have some real fluid movement with the paint and keep it thin. But I am at times if it's not moving quite as smoothly as I want, I'm adding a touch of the walnut oil as I paint. But the more I paint, and as I near the end of certain areas and the end of the entire painting, I'm going to be using less medium, if any at all. The very final brush strokes will be the thickest and won't have any medium in them. I'm being economical with my values also. You'll notice, like with this vase, it's not pure white. Even the light areas of this, it's not just white. There's color and there's darker values than you may think initially. And the reason for that is because there's a highlight. How am I going to give the appearance or the look of a highlight, which probably would be just about pure white or maybe white with a touch of blue in it, if I'm not economical with these values, if I'm not accurate with these values, and I keep even the light areas here a little darker than that highlight's going to be? I'll show you what I mean. This looks white, I'm sure, on the camera and to those who are watching here in the audience, but it's not white. I'll show you. This would be, here, let's put a brush. Here is pure titanium white. Do you see how dark that really was? Okay, I don't know if it shows on the camera as well, but this is a much darker value. Not terribly dark, it's still lighter in on the scale, but it's much darker than this bright white, or at least a value. It's at least a value darker than that white. But by doing that, I'm able to conserve my values and get the appearance of a highlight. So what about the pattern here? Depending on the object, sometimes I put in the blue first and then the white. Sometimes I put in the white and then the blue and work them together. I just have tried both ways. And now when I look at something, I assess ahead of time what would be the most efficient way of painting this. Cobalt blue, my King's blue there. I really like King's blue. Oh, isn't that pretty? Pure color. I mean, just the two colors there, and then some areas will just be the pure cobalt. And I'm just putting paint on each time and dragging it in. And it creates a nice soft edge here. As I drag it that way, it creates a really beautiful edge, so that it looks as though it's part of the vase and not just sitting on top of the vase. A little bit of ultramarine blue deep, because it gets darker down there. I'm using a soft mongoose brush as well. If I were using my bristle brush at this point, some of those striations, it would scratch the paint surface a little too much at this point. And I want some of those softer edges. Sometimes the blue, because the light is cool, on the lighter side of it, it has a little bit of a purple tone to it. So I've added just a touch of permanent rose. I'm going to put some of that in. I'm not being terribly literal with the pattern either. I just want it to look interesting. I want it to be something that appeals to me. And I can take a dry, soft brush, usually a flat, and soften these edges, especially in the shadows. Now, talking about edges, there are several determining factors. Some just paint them however they want them, some artists, I mean, which is fine, whatever you prefer. However, I like to observe what's in front of me and evaluate what makes that edge the way that it is. So I consider a number of things. First of all, value. Where there's a dark value next to a light value, like we have the white up here and the dark background, it creates this harder edge. We'll harden it here too, but it creates, to me, a hard edge. Where the values are similar, for instance, the shadow of this watermelon and the value of the background there, one blends right into the other because the values are the same. Even though the colors are different, the values are the same. So it's a lost edge. I can just blend that edge, make it lost, and it causes it to recede. It causes it to turn back or go back, be pushed to the background. Okay? So I didn't make that up. It's there. All right? The other determining factor is as things turn, if it's a soft turn, if it's not an abrupt change, like a cube, you'd have a harder edge. Something rounded, you tend to have a softer edge, like a face tends to have a softer edge. Even if there's a great deal of contrast, sometimes it can still have a soft edge because of the innate quality of that. Speaking of innate quality, that also is a determining factor because something like hair, you would never have hard edges on hair because the innate quality of hair is that it is soft. Okay? So those are how I determine my edges. I don't just blur everything and make hard edges where I want them. You could, and some artists do, and they do so quite well, I suppose. But I want to be true to what's in front of me, and so I've taken the time to study and assess what makes an edge the way that it is. And that's what I do. So I'm just going over some of this with my dry, clean brush, soft brush. So because of the contrast of the light in this vase and the background, as I said, I'm going to make that edge a little harder. Now I can break up those edges for the sake of interest. Sometimes even with a hard edge, especially if it's a flower, something like that, or just to make things look a little more painterly, I'll maintain the hard edge, but I'll leave some of it broken up just a bit, just so that it is, to me, a little more interesting. Now, a little later, I'm going to check my drawing and work on that ellipse and make sure that I get it correct. But at this moment, I'm not terribly concerned about it. I want to move on. I'm not necessarily making choices in that I'm making something up. I'm trying to paint what I see. So knowing that the light is cool and the shadows are warmer, sometimes I know I need to make the shadow a little warmer than I initially thought. But most of the time I am very much just trying to paint what I see, to analyze what I see so that I can paint it. I've noticed, because I do teach some workshops and I deal with, just painting with some students and things, I have noticed that many tend to make their shadows lighter than they should be, especially with white things. You saw how dark I went initially in those shadows, but it works. In fact, I could probably go even a bit darker and it would still look correct. So don't be afraid to go dark in those shadows. Okay, that's how it is. Make sure that you're going dark enough. And if you're not getting a lot of dark shadows, make sure that your setup has a light source only from one direction, unless it's a portrait or something and you've got two light sources. You'll see that a lot, and that's very interesting. But in most cases, at least one of those is especially brighter than the other. And the reason for that is because you don't want anything to just appear flat. So I'm working on this honeydew melon, I think that's what it is, back there. I go to the produce aisle of the grocery store and I don't particularly, I don't walk around identifying anything, I just look for what I want. I look for color, shape, and size. All right, so that's too cool. I've had a lot of strange looks in the produce aisle. I often play Hamlet with the produce. I tend to hold it out and look at it because I need to see it from a distance. So it looks like Hamlet, I suppose. I had one woman come up to me at one point and said, "You're awfully particular about your lemons, you know." And so she must have thought I was OCD or something. But that's exactly what she said. "You're awfully particular about your lemons." So, I often won't even explain. I'll let it pass. I'm too focused. Don't bother me, lady. I'm looking at lemons. All right, so looking at that, I feel it's slightly too light. I mean, it's close. It's so close. I'm just going to add a little more yellow ochre to it. I've noticed, especially as of late, I'm at the point now when I paint, I'm looking for these little nuances in my subject matter. I've noticed, do you see this purple I'm putting in between the light and the shadow? I've noticed there's a transitional color. I don't know any other way to describe it. In fact, there's probably a more proper term. I'm self-taught. I didn't go to art school. And I didn't even have a lot of books to read. I had never watched an art DVD or taken a workshop. So there's a lot of things that I do that are taught, but I don't necessarily know the proper term. So there may be a proper term for it. But to me, I just call it a transitional color. Or perhaps it's a mid-tone, I don't know. But it's the point where coolness transitions to warmth. Okay? It's that point when suddenly things are making that turn. They're making that transition. It's not abrupt. It's not sudden. It's a little softer. There's this transition. And I've noticed even in faces, I think Jeremy Lipking does it so beautifully, and so does Mr. Richard, but where there's this color in between the light and the shadow on a face. and sometimes it's violet, purple, or lavender. Sometimes it's green. I don't always know, and I don't necessarily know the science of why it is particular colors, but I know it's there, and so I look for it, and I see it when I look at some of these melons, that transitional color, and I want to put it in. It's the difference between a beginning painter and one that's more experienced. You tend to, eventually, you look for those nuances. I think initially it's all about just getting it in and you're really excited. But then you begin to look for, with people, you call it idiosyncrasies, the things that make that person uniquely different from the next. Even if there are similarities, there's still something about them physically that makes them different. And it's the same in all of nature. As far as we know, as far as scientific discovery has progressed, we have never found two snowflakes exactly alike. Can you imagine all of the snow that's fallen on Earth? And I live in California where it doesn't snow. I wish it did, but it doesn't. But just to think of that, no two leaves are exactly alike. I take that information and I put it into my work because I want my work to look like it naturally occurred, as opposed to really stiff and set up. I want it to have a natural, organic feel, as though we stumbled upon something that the artist thought was beautiful. And so if I can take that bit of information and somehow put it into my paintings, I know I'll achieve that effect. So those nuances, or whatever you want to call them, those idiosyncrasies, the things that make one melon different from the other, observe. It's all about observation, and that's from the very beginning, all throughout the painting process. We're constantly observing. Since I started painting that and I've got some of the colors on my palette, I'll move right to this one. But again, is there something about that one that's slightly different? Does it have more of the purple in the middle, or that transitional color? It's not necessarily just purple, but is there anything about it that makes it look unique? I like this. Do you see how the wash of the shadow color is showing through? I didn't paint over all of it. I might adjust some of it, but from here it kind of looks like scars on that melon, and I'm going to leave them alone for now. Planning ahead. I could easily leave this without any paint on it. See? Planning ahead. It's so important. I'm not saying that I will leave it that way, but now I have an option. If I cover the entire thing, I don't have the option. Or if I don't plan ahead, if I do my entire wash as transparent oxide red, or my entire wash is green, I don't have the option to leave exposed wash, that initial wash. I can't leave any of that if I've not done it correctly, if I've not planned ahead. I've done paintings where an entire flower is just that initial wash left alone, but the colors cut around it give the shape, and because the tone of the canvas is correct, it looks like a flower. It's our secret. No one will know. Well, maybe if the collector looks at it closely, he'll figure it out. So this one, I think there's more green. Let's make it more green. Sometimes, because nature is so varied, because we know that that life is so varied, sometimes if I have something or things that are very similar, I will exaggerate a quality about one in order to make it look different, even more different from the other. that goes back to what I said earlier about making sure what I'm putting down is strengthening what I've already established. If I take one rose and I have it in my composition and it's strong by itself, it grabs your attention, it probably will look good. If I paint it, I'll make sure that it looks good. But if I take the same kind of flower and I put them all in the same position all over the canvas, or I put 12 of them, what happened to the first one? It's no longer strong. It no longer has the presence that it did before, because now it's multiplied by 12. So instead, I make the other 11 different somehow. I turn them around, have them going off the page, crop them, whatever I can do, cover them or cluster them together. And by doing that, I'm not weakening that first thing. So those kinds of decisions, making those kinds of decisions are crucial in order for this to be a successful painting. Now, I'm not going to paint that sticker on this melon, though I have dared Mr. Richard to do it at times. He's yet to do that. I might do it one day. We'll see. You tell him. I'll do it. But I'm not going to do it today, I think. But this is, there's a kind of a bit of a highlight. It's not a strong highlight because, it's not a hard edged highlight because it's not terribly shiny. The watermelon's a little more shiny, so it's going to have a stronger highlight or a more noticeable highlight. This is a bit more gradual. And I'm not even going to put a highlight on that one. See, this makes it makes that one different. All right, let's paint the watermelon. I'll clean my palette very quickly, or at least an area of it. Now at home, you're watching the video, clean your palette. Clean your palette 4 times as much as I've done it in this video. Always, always keep it clean. Keep the color clean. Don't be afraid to throw the paint out. It's no longer good to me once it's been contaminated. So even with your, just stop and think of ways that you can create variety. Think of it. How many ways can you create variety? Not just in your subject matter, like what we talked about, but what about varying your brush size? What about varying the thickness or thinness of your paint? Aren't you then creating more variety? Essentially, how interesting would your painting probably become if you began to think that way? If you set out to create variety in whatever way was possible, think of how much more interesting your painting will probably be. So vary the brush size, vary the kind of brush. Don't treat that as a rule. I'm not saying you can't paint an entire painting with one brush. You can. But I've noticed from experience, I'm merely just speaking from experience, I've noticed that for me, it tends to then begin, by the end, it just looks very stiff, it looks uninteresting, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't look the way that I originally intended, let's just put it that way. And it certainly doesn't look as beautiful as the subject to begin with. So what are some practical ways that you can create variety? Varying your brush size is one of them. Varying the paint thickness. And then looking for the nuances in the subject itself. So now, what would my edge be here? I've got a shadow. Oops, that was a mistake. But that's all right, we can fix it. I've got a shadow here. So it's lighter than the shadow falling or being cast onto the watermelon, but it's not as light as this. So there's not as much contrast here as there would be if it were as light as this area here. So there's some contrast, but not as much contrast, right? But there's more contrast than there is here. See the varying degrees? So this would be a lost edge. This would be a softer edge. This would be a hard edge. See how it varies in degree? All right? We want to look for that. So we know now this should be a softer edge. Not a lost edge entirely, just a soft one. So what kind of edge would that be? We've got a great amount of contrast. I'm going to wipe away just a little bit with my paper towel. But we've got a great deal of contrast because the light shining on the half of the cantaloupe here from my position is, I see it right up against the dark shadow on the watermelon and the plum that's in the shadow there that you may not even be able to see. But from my vantage point, I can see it. So you've got a great amount of contrast. What kind of edge, then, would that be? See how it's just merely asking the right questions and then answering? I know that that contrast has to be there. It creates a hard edge, a very hard edge. And see how the harder edges come forward and the softer ones go back? They tend to recede, all right? So I'm creating depth through a variety of edges, but I'm determining what my edges are based on what I see in front of me. I'm not just making them up. And then as it turns away from the light, it's getting darker and also warmer in temperature. On the cantaloupe, there's this green on the surface that where it's cut. There's sort of a green outline, a ring around it. So now you'll notice I'm putting thicker paint on. I'm getting thicker as I go. I'm not adding any medium at this point, which would be my walnut oil. I'm putting on thicker paint. I start thin and work thickly. Now that's a rule, but it's backed by science, okay? Thin paint over thick is going to cause the paint to crack eventually. So understanding the science of paint, I know not to do that. It's not a rule, it would be a law, okay? So I start thinner if that's my intention, if I'm not going to go thick right from the beginning. But I would never put on thick paint, let it dry, and then put thin paint over it or wash over it. It will then cause that thicker paint to crack. Also, as just even working this way, the alla prima method, wet into wet, or all at once, I am starting thinner because it's very difficult to work with thick paint. See, my thickest brush strokes, if you look at my paintings, the really thick paint that's applied either by a brush or a palette knife, it's very difficult to manipulate once it's put on there. So save those for later. Save those for last. If you start putting on paint with a trowel right from the beginning, you better keep it going that way. But no, it's going to be difficult to manipulate. And if that's not your intention, start thin and then get thick as you go along. All right? Until you're eventually just putting paint straight from the tube or not mixed with anything at all. A little bit of light within the cantaloupe. There's some crevices where the seeds go. Now, initially when I cut the fruit in half, the seeds were all on the same plane as that cut, and so it was all flat, one value. Well, I like to make things interesting, so I poked my finger around, made those crevices a little deeper so that I could get darker shadows. Okay, I control everything. And so by doing that, I've got some shadow. I'll put maybe a little more than I've already done there. And then I've got just these little bits of light. And that was just some cad yellow deep and cad orange mixed with white. Some Viridian and whites and my King's blue. Let's see, perhaps a little yellow of some kind. This highlight on the watermelon. I think I could get a little lighter. Who knew watermelon could be so beautiful? All most people will ever do is eat it for 4th of July. But I think that's the responsibility of an artist. If one thing that attracted me to Mr. Richards' philosophies about art was that there's already enough ugly in the world. There are already enough making a political statement or preaching whatever it is that they want. And there's nothing wrong with that. We have the right to do those things. But with so much ugly in the world, I like to choose to instead paint what I think is beautiful. But sometimes that involves pointing out something that maybe most people would just be passing by. I think seeing something beautiful in watermelon is a good example. So if I can make someone stop and see the beauty in something so simple, then I've made the most of the language that I have. Or at least I've done something with it that I feel is of value. So look at the variety of color that we're putting in there. There's purple, there's yellow, green, dark green, light green, the blue kind of shadow. Look at all of the variety. Even the stripes on the watermelon, no two are alike, and no two watermelons even are alike. Isn't that great? We'll never grow bored. Not if we're paying attention. Oops, too light. Nope, wrong. There's a yellow spot on most melons because that's where they sit on the ground, and so they don't receive any lights there, and it never turns color. How interesting. My family thinks I'm nuts because none of them are artists, and so I remember just commenting on things at the dinner table, like, look at how green that is. It's kind of odd coming from a 12-year-old, you know. Do you see how things have changed? The mode of painting has changed. I started out laying things in really quickly as I described, blocking in, and now things are going a little slower. Okay, I'm being careful about the brushwork, making sure that everything is just right, the edges and just the way that the paint is applied, the way that I want it to be. Okay, so don't get in a hurry. I like what I've heard some artists say, you paint as though you're going to die halfway through. And the reason for that is just to get you to think that it's not really about finishing the painting. It's about making sure that whatever you did do, you maintained that integrity with which you started. Remember, we talked about the importance of a sound start. So you maintain that soundness, whether you're going to finish the painting or not. Because someone may see this, and so you didn't get to finish it. Make sure that whatever you did do, you did well. One thing I obviously want to work in this area here primarily because it's the focal area, or it's where most of my interest, that's where I want the viewer's eye to go to, and all of the interesting relationships between the various objects that are there. One thing I'm going to have to do, and I know this from experience, is I want to give the objects a sense of weight. We're working with two-dimensional products, they're three-dimensional in themselves, but it's a two-dimensional medium. We're not actually putting fruit onto a canvas. We're merely painting the way that light reflects off of something. And so we're using paint in order to do that, so we're limited. But I still want to give a sense of weight to these objects, and the only way I know of doing that is looking to see what's there, what's happening before us. And there's a shadow under most things, and that shadow is very dark. Sometimes it's a really dark line underneath. And that, as soon as we put that in, it gives weight to those objects and dimension and form. And without it, it becomes very flat. All right? So for instance, beneath these two pieces of fruit that are here, now, it's not a perfect line. We're not drawing an outline or anything like that. Sometimes it's just a few little notes of dark, and then we'll start to paint what goes next to them. But I always put what's easiest in first, or what I know I can put down in it and it be very accurate, or as accurate as possible. Because then I have something to compare everything else to, all of the succeeding elements or brush strokes or colors. I have more of a chance of getting those correct if I put down the things that are easier for me first. Someone had, on their question or comment card, had asked, why flowers or fruit? And I think that's such an interesting question. And at first, I get that sometimes, and I brush it off like, well, why do I have to explain that? But it really is a good question because it goes along with what I was saying earlier. I remember at an art show back when I first started and I was doing those outdoor art fairs, I had this woman come up and ask me, why do I paint pears? And I thought it was so strange because why would you go up to a person and ask them that? Isn't it kind of obvious that, well, because they wanted to? But then I began to think, well, maybe the rest of the world doesn't see what I see when I look at a pear or when I look at any kind of piece of fruit or anything. Lori was just telling me how our friend Nancy Guzik years ago when studying art and her friend Rose Franson painted toilet paper, rolls of toilet paper. I mean, I love that because it's not about the subject. It's about the way that the light is reflecting off of it, or it's about the texture. There's so many different reasons to paint something. And so when I go through the grocery store, the market, or just down the street, anywhere that I go, anytime I see something that just catches my eye for whatever reason, I want to share that. So that's why I paint what I paint. I don't choose. I'll never forget. I heard it recently, but I know I'll never forget. I heard the artist Mian Situ say something so profound, I thought. And it was his own personal philosophy. He said that I'm not interested in painting beautiful things as much as I'm interested in painting things beautifully. I thought, how wonderful a philosophy that was, because if you were only interested in painting beautiful things, you wouldn't have a variety of, if you're a portrait painter, you'd have no variety in your portraits, would you? Because you're only interested in painting conventionally beautiful things or people. But if you take the time to see, beauty in everyone or everything, and you choose to paint it beautifully, is how much more powerful, right? Or how much more lasting that would be. So whatever you choose to paint, that's why I said, paint. I don't care if you paint toilet bowls. If you find it beautiful and you can paint it beautifully and show the rest of the world how you see it, do it. To me, that is what it's all about. One thing I want to note, while I'm looking at my subject, I am squinting. And I do that in order to see value and to simplify. Not to see color. I need to keep my eyes fully open to see color, but to see the relationships, the value relationships, to see how one thing looks when compared to the next. I squint and compare a lot. In fact, I used to do it so often growing up and I got into such a habit of squinting. And everywhere I looked, I was always trying to see how would I paint this, how would I paint that landscape or person, that my parents used to always question me whether or not I needed glasses. So my mother was quite concerned. I think Daniel needs glasses, because I was always doing this. Everywhere I went, I was squinting, So I'm looking for the little bits of color in each of these pieces of fruit, bringing them to a more finished state. That doesn't mean that everything has to be put in. So many things can merely be implied, I think. A friend was talking about using the example of facial recognition. We have facial recognition software in computers, but in humans it's even built in where we can recognize a face. Have you ever seen a photo? It's sort of popular on the internet now, where they will take a photo of a very famous person and they will break it down to just a few pixels. Just a few pixels. And you can, from a distance or first glance, you can recognize who that person is in the photo, who that represents. That's because we have internally this facial recognition ability. We've memorized things, basically. And so with painting, especially painting in this manner where things are done more loosely or impressionistically, it's the same. You don't have to put every bit of information down that's there. You can imply many things, and the viewer's eye will put the rest together, and it'll look just like what you intended it to look like. So I'm getting thicker with the paint application here. Anywhere you want to draw attention, the attention of the viewer, use thicker paint in those areas. In general, my shadow areas, the paint is thinner. That's because I don't necessarily want to draw attention to them. So what I'm doing right now, by adding that light, and then I'm going to work on the shadow a bit, I'm modeling the form. What that means is by adding the light and shadow, paying attention to the values that are there, I am giving it a sense of, giving it its shape, that rounded shape, giving it form. Someone had asked, I think, about why cool light. And one thing I want to point out is that it doesn't mean that the light is necessarily blue. Sometimes when we hear cool light, we think blue light, and warm light is yellow. That's not necessarily true, although incandescent lights often cast a yellow, a really harsh yellow on everything. But with the cooler lights like what we're using today, I forget what the Kelvin is, but it's over 5,000 Kelvin, probably 55 or 57. they're mimicking the light almost to a T of what you would get from a north-facing window, where it's indirect sunlight, meaning that you never have at any point direct sunlight coming through where it would be warm sunlight. So some ask, well, how do you display that, or why do you choose that? Once the painting is finished, how would you display it? Would you then have to display it under the same light? And the answer to that is no. The reason why I choose it is because I can actually see more color. When you're using this temperature of light, it's more like a full spectrum of color that you can see. It's not necessarily casting a blue haze over everything or a blue light. It's allowing you to see more of the color that's there on these objects innately. And with a warm light, it influences everything, and it makes everything appear as though it has a yellow cast to it. And so I don't think it looks very good. It still can look good, but you're seeing less color. I love to paint things like peaches and apricots because it's not like painting an apple. Apples have very smooth skin and are very shiny. Peaches and apricots, those sorts of things, they have this fuzz, basically, for lack of a better word, on them. And so it creates this sort of purple halo sometimes around them. And the reason for that is because it's very much like when the moon appears as though it's rising, even though as it revolves around the earth and appears as though it's rising. It's more orange in color because we're seeing through more atmosphere. In order to see it, we're looking through more atmosphere than when it's directly overhead. And it's the same with something like a peach. All of those little hairs on the peach, they're reflecting light, and we're seeing through more hairs or fuzz on the outer rims of it than we are directly in the center from whatever our vantage point is. See what science can do? So you understand why it is the way it is, and then you'll look for it. You probably won't see some things unless you know to look for them. And I'm not trying to teach you how to paint as much as I'm trying to teach you or inspire you to learn how to see. Okay? It's all about learning how to see. All right, so a little bit of a shadow over here. Not dark enough. Let's put some transparent oxide red. Transparent oxide red is such an indispensable color for me. I use it all the time. So see how these pieces of fruit are essentially right in the middle of the canvas, but you don't even, I don't know that anyone even picks up on that. So it breaks that rule, doesn't it? But because we've done a good job of painting it accurately, and through edge work and technique painted it interestingly, you don't even notice that it breaks the rule. All right, so another really great question was, what do you do when you're working with perishable items? Is there an order to things? And I always think of it in terms of, well, it's like a family portrait. If you were going to paint your entire family portrait, you paint great-great-grandpa first. Or you paint what's going to change first. Is that shot color worthy? That is, isn't it? Okay. So you paint what's going to change first. So you would paint an infant first, right? Because you know it's likely to change drastically, or your dog, whatever's going to move first, right? So it's the same when I'm painting a large, complex still life. Usually, in most cases, you want to paint your center of interest first. You want to focus on those areas usually because you want those to be the most finished, and when you do that, you'll find that you can leave the outer things less finished. But when dealing with things that are ephemeral, things that are going to perish quickly, I usually will put those in first. Something like a teacup or a vase that a year from now, if that were to sit there, or I were to reset it up, a year from now, that vase is going to look exactly the same. So I paint what's going to change, what's most likely to change first. Another great thing I learned from my friend Kathy Anderson when painting flowers is get those little vials from the florist, stick the flowers, the stems in those, and they stay fresh for a really long time. Okay? So there's all kinds of little tricks. All right, so let's paint one of those flowers. I still have some room on my palette, otherwise I would clean it, but I have a rose right here. I might put the other one in another spot. I kind of laid it there, and so I can look at it and easily compartmentalize and put it in another area if I want. But this one is definitely clearly in our subject, our composition. And so I do want to put it in. So many times I find it more interesting, and that's a word I tend to use a lot. I need to look in my thesaurus for synonymous words with interesting. But one thing that I find so great about flowers, and I paint them so often, is they're just as interesting or even more beautiful from the backside as they are the front. Fascinating. That's a good word. Okay, so thank you, Kristen Teeth. They're fascinating, just as fascinating, if not sometimes more so, from the back. You've sold some of my paintings of roses, and I almost always have most of them facing another direction. Maybe one is facing the viewer, but so many of them are going all in different directions, and they're just as beautiful. And so don't be afraid to do that. I think it's important, rather, especially when going back to that idea of making things appear natural looking, mimicking nature. It's a way of creating variety. So notice that's really the same color, except perhaps there's a bit more yellow ochre in it, but it's that transparent oxide brown, viridian, and white. I love starting a warm gray shadow with that mixture. And so that's going to act as the shadow color. We might put a little bit of variety in that in a minute, but that really makes the shadow color of this rose, the petals on this rose. And then I begin adding more white to it. One thing that really, I would say, one of the most important things I heard Mr. Richard say that just made so much sense to me when I first heard it was he said, Dan, we're just painting shapes of color. It's all just, if you break it all down, it's all just shapes of color. And even though I knew that, when I heard it said, it just made everything then made sense. It's like the world opened up and was so easy. Things were easier to see. So it's all just shapes of color. Painting a rose, as complicated as it seems, they're just shapes of color. So if we can match those shapes and those colors, we'll have what looks to be a rose in front of us. So as the rose turns into where I think those are called sepals, as it goes in that direction, this one, looking at it, it gets to be a little more yellow. Speaking of yellow, I normally have cadmium lemon on my palette, but I didn't have any with me today. So you could do this a number of ways. Sometimes I'll use something like a palette knife if I want. The dogwood flowers that I painted yesterday were done primarily with a palette knife. So lots of harder edges. But this I see as being a little bit softer. Again, there's a bit of that transitional color. I don't know whether or not it shows up on film, and for the audience, when you get a chance to come up during the breaks, you'll see it. But there's, again, that little bit of lavender in there as it turns from the shadow to the light, or vice versa. That in-between mid-tone value is what totally changes that from being a few little brush marks to all of a sudden it's a petal turning, and those are the things, like I said earlier, that's what separates the beginning painter from that experienced. When you see a painting from someone who's very experienced, you see those things, and you may wonder what about their work makes it look that way. It's often those little things. So sometimes there's a real order where I'm working from one end to the other, or I work from the center out, the center of interest, wherever it might be, the focal area out. Sometimes it's all over. That goes along with saying what we started with earlier about there's more than just one way to do this. All right? And I encourage you to try it a number of ways. These are the little slats, or the holes. I liked this little box that the peaches came in from the grocery store. But experiment, Now I want to go home and paint toilet paper. Do something different. See if I can make something like that appear beautiful. But also in just your methods, your way of painting, changing it up, trying it a new way. Don't ever stop observing. All right, just putting in little bits of detail. Obviously, I want to get this to as finished a state as possible while we're still filming. We talked a little bit yesterday during one of the events just about coming back to finish a painting and what do you do and how do you approach it. And so one of the things that was mentioned was just about painting, like if you have to reset it up, you adjust, you sort of, I don't remember all of the words that were used. But if I didn't get to a piece of fruit over here and I reset up another one, I wouldn't try to make it look like the old one, I'd make it look like the new. So I never used to come back to paintings, but I've found it to be a good thing, learning how to finish a painting. So don't ever be in a hurry. Just make sure whatever you did do, you did it well. And if you can come back to it later, great. Sometimes I've noticed that paintings look better a couple of stages usually, or steps before the finished one. Rarely does it ever look as good when it's overworked. Sometimes, like I said, when I'm evaluating the edges, I'll see areas where I'll maintain the hard edge that I have, but just for that painterly look, I'll break it up. Even on a hard edge here, just with a soft brush, I'll sort of drag from one color into the next, just to break that up a bit. Make it look a little more fascinating, I suppose. Not everywhere. I don't want to get carried away, but just a little bit. Why not? Just putting in some of the fabric that's underneath the white cloth. So the things going through my mind at this point are just what areas need to be taken further? What areas need to be left alone? And then if I decide, okay, this needs to be developed more, I have to then decide how. How am I going to do it? What sort of paint application have I worked out in my mind? Just developing some of these leaves here, some of the colors. I love to paint these as loosely as possible. Anytime I'm dealing with leaves, the less detail I can put in them, the better. I don't paint every little vein, every little subtle change about them. But what's so fascinating, like yesterday when I painted some dogwood blossoms on a tree and people were watching, they said it looks like every vein in that leaf is there even though you didn't put it in. Simply because of the texture of the paint, there were ridges from the brush and the paint was applied kind of thickly, so the way that you see it from a distance, it looks like veins. So that's what I do with almost anything that I can get away, anywhere I can get away with that. I just imply it. I can always add more detail, but it's harder to put in detail and then have to take it out. There's a plum there. So transparent oxide brown, viridian, and white, again, because I'm going to continue with this shadow. I think I put a little bit of yellow ochre in it probably too. One thing when dealing with mixing colors, I don't have, apart from I've done that a lot for the grays with this painting, but I don't have color mixtures. In some of the older DVDs, I did have certain piles of mixtures that I used often, and they were a great teaching aid. But that's not how I paint, and I don't think of it as this color plus this color will make this, and I memorize it. What I've done instead is I've grown so familiar with these colors on my palette and how they respond to one another that I think of it almost just intuitively. I'm not even really processing mentally what I'm mixing, if that even makes sense. I don't know any other way to explain it. I'll have to think of it. But there comes a point when you grow so familiar with your palette that you no longer think the way that you did about it. You just start mixing things together in order to achieve the look that you want. Look for those transitional colors, even with, I think especially probably with white things, like the white fabric. There's so often that transitional color again, either a lavender, purple, or a green. I suppose it could be any color, just depends on how it's reflecting the light, but it seems to be so often this color. Just going to put a few notes of color down here. Because of our time restrictions, although on the film it's edited down quite a bit, we've limited our time today to do this. But I feel very confident in what I have done gives me very clear direction to then take it home and refine any areas that I feel need to be refined in order to bring it up to the level that I'm happy with in most of my work or all of my work. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to take it home and correct things that perhaps need to be corrected. I'll take a reference photo with my camera of the setup. I'll put it on a monitor or something like that. I don't usually print it out because so often information is lost when you print the photo, especially I think in the shadows. It flattens so many of the shadows and you lose the little nuances like we were talking about earlier. And so I'll instead have it coming through a monitor, like a computer, and a large monitor, and use that as reference and then complete this painting. But thank you so much for being here today and for joining me, and I hope that you learned something. Okay.